Thank you. Thank you very much. So, before I start, I just want to say thanks to Martin and Kieran for inviting me to speak here tonight. Thank you all for you coming as well. I really appreciate it. So, for those of you who don't know me, my name's Carl James, obviously. I'm an alternative knowledge researcher. And what I wanted to do tonight really was kind of tell a story that most of you might actually be quite familiar with it, and I thought I was quite familiar with it. It turned out I was completely wrong. This was a couple of years ago. I started to investigate the idea behind this 1938 War of the Worlds radio broadcast, and this idea of this mass panic across America when it was broadcast, everybody panicked on this kind of thing. And it turned out it's actually a very, very different story behind the whole thing. And so that's what I'm going to do tonight. I'm going to go through it, and I'm going to go off on a few little rabbit holes and things like that. So before I get into that, I just want to go back to the very beginning. The story of the War of the Worlds, H.G. Wells, 1898, a classic science fiction novel set in England in 1899, story of an invasion of the Earth by aliens from Mars, and it's told by this central character who's called just the narrator in the book. And we have these projectiles being launched from Mars to the Earth. They land these cylinders, they open up, they discover one on Horsell Common, I think it was, near Woking in Surrey. And the Martians start building these tripod war machines, and they come out and they've got these energy weapons, the heat ray, and this poisonous black chemical called the black smoke. And they come out, the British Army turns up, starts fighting them, quickly overpowered, and the Martians set out across the landscape. They start attacking everybody. They're joined by tripods from other cylinders, and the narrator describes his journeys across the landscape, all these different characters that he meets along the way, and it seems that all hope is lost. And most of you may actually know the story, but it turns out at the end that the Martians are incapacitated and they die by the simple bacteria that's on Earth that humans have become long immune to. So we move forward then to 1938. This chap here, Orson Welles, some of you may know him, and he's probably one of the most infamous adaptations in this 125 years since the book was published. It was broadcast on Sunday the 30th of October, so it's the day before Halloween, 1938. Orson Welles and the Mercury Theatre on the air, and it was CBS Radio. They staged a live adaptation of it. The producer was John Houseman. The adaptation was written by Wells himself and Houseman's collaborator Howard He Koch. I'm going to be bringing down a lot of names tonight because it kind of all ties together. It's a very complicated web to all of this. So Orson Welles was a maverick. He was a bit of a darling in the industry. He loved to dramatise things, he loved to play with his audience and that kind of thing. And he loved using the medium of radio to mess with people's minds, basically, their perceptions of things that are going on. And contrary to popular opinion, Wells was not actually looking to tell a fictional story, even a science fiction story, really. What he wanted to do was take an existing story and create like a fake crisis, something along the lines of like a dramatic news broadcast, that kind of thing. And it's an idea that he'd actually been playing with for quite a while. And he said, I had conceived the idea of doing a radio broadcast in such a manner that a crisis would actually seem to be happening and would be broadcast in such a dramatised form as to appear to be a real event taking place at that time rather than a mere radio play. So it's an apt choice, War of the Worlds, because if you go back and you read the novel, H.G. Wells actually used British Ordnance Survey maps to plot the route of the Martians across the landscape. He was referring to genuine newspaper articles, scientific papers that were written at the time, and he wrote it in this sort of reportage style. So it had that immediacy to it, that realism to it. So it's interesting that Wells, wanting to do what he wanted to do, this idea of taking a fake news type thing, that he would actually use something that was based in realism. So they transplanted the story from the UK to America, and I think it was New Jersey, that sort of region of America, sort of East Coast, New York, that kind of thing. And the Martian cylinders landed at Grover's Mill, just at New Jersey, and that was a real location, like the places that were written about in the original book. So on the night of Sunday, October the 30th, the play was broadcast live, and they did make an initial announcement, this was a play. It wasn't real, don't take it as such. Actually, I think they did a break somewhere in the middle as well, and they said again at the end, so it was clearly signposted that this was not a real thing, but it was presented as real. The first 2/3 of it, they had all these like music hall type things, standard radio fare, that kind of thing. They had a weather report, they had a breaking news bulletin in it. So it did seem to somebody who might have missed the warning at the beginning that it was fake, that it was a dramatisation, that it was real. So it was only the last 20 minutes of the hour that it shifted to a first-person dramatic format. We had that character Richard Pearson, Professor Richard Pearson, played by Orson Welles, and he's recounting the final phase of the Martian conquest of Earth. So interesting little bits and pieces talk about the realism here now, because we had this actor, Frank Reddick, and he portrayed Carl Phillips, a reporter, describing the attack at Grover's Mill, and that added further realism to it. Later in the broadcast, the actors used something that was actually unheard of at the time, which was dead air. And I think it was about 6 seconds that they just killed it, stone dead. The attack on New York, you hear the reporter choking and he can't breathe and that kind of thing. And they cut to dead air for about 6 seconds, which was unheard of. And so 6 seconds. And Kenneth Delmar also portrayed the Secretary of the Interior in it, and that muddled things up even more because he actually sounded like President Franklin Roosevelt at the time, and people mistook him for being the president. He actually wasn't. He was a fictional character in it. So Wells referred to real locations and the scientific establishment. He talked about Princeton University in it as well. I'll come to them again in a moment. So it adds to the realism, and that seemed to be the watchword with it, because in the 1930s there were certain rules of conduct that existed in radio, and there's this excellent book called Broadcast Hysteria, Orson Welles, War of the Worlds and the Art of Fake News by A. Brad Schwartz. I'm going to refer to him quite a bit actually in this talk. And he said, major networks banned the use of pre-recorded content in the 1930s. Everything listeners ever heard over NBC or CBS in that decade, every concert, every dramatic programme and every comedy show aired live because of preference, not technical necessity. The networks argued that use of recordings in news broadcasts, even more than in musical or dramatic programming, was particularly deceptive, a sort of hoax. It's interesting the age we live in nowadays. A hoax on the radio, because audiences have been trained to regard radio shows as live events, and by that logic truth and liveness went hand in hand. One could not exist without the other. A recording, even of a real event, seemed less authentic to 1930 listeners than a live performance of a fictional programme. It's a bit of a strange setup, that. So history goes that there were a lot of people panicked to the War of the Worlds broadcast, that it was real. Millions panicked across America, but if you carefully study this subject, you find there's actually quite a different story to what went on. And I'm going to come back to that in a moment. But these are the main points that you will see when you read, you go on places like Wikipedia and that, and you just look at the official version of what happened, the so-called panic. So, first one, millions literally panicked. People gathered what they could, carried and fled their homes. Families filled their cars and fled out of towns and cities. People wandered streets, alerting passers-by to an invasion from Mars. Churches were filled with people praying. Hospitals admitted heart attack victims. I'll come back to that in a moment. Some people committed suicide. That's another claim. I'll come back to that one in a moment. Country folk formed armed gangs and headed off into the night to search for alien invaders. So those are the main key points. I'm going to talk about two specific cases here, which is about media muddling now around that story. The first one is these two guys from Princeton University. So in the early part of the broadcast, Associated Press reported that a meteor, a real meteor, had hit the ground at Grover's Mill. They didn't mention anything about Martians invading the Earth or anything like that. They didn't talk about the radio broadcast, anything like that. And that prompted the Philadelphia Inquirer to contact Princeton Press Club for confirmation about this meteorite. And excited at the prospect of finding a freshly landed meteorite, these two guys, Dr. Arthur F. Buddington, who was the chair of geology department at Princeton, he grabbed his associate professor, Dr. Harry Hess. They jumped in the car, they raced off down to Grover's Mill, wandering around in the middle of the night looking for this meteorite. They found nothing. They did bump into a few people in the woods that were looking for it as well. Nothing to do with aliens, nothing to do with the radio broadcast, anything like that. It was just a genuinely legit. I mean, let's face it, these guys, they're looking for a bit of credibility. Going to find a meteorite, we'll get ourselves on the front page of an article or something like that. But in the following days, the newspapers reported on them and their trip into the wood. And rather than accurately recounting the story of these two keen professors, full of scientific curiosity, all that kind of thing, they were painted as examples of people who believed the War of the Worlds broadcast. The professors hadn't even listened to the radio play. So that's one example. Second one here is this chap called William Dock. If anybody's familiar with War of the Worlds, they might recognise this picture. It's a very infamous picture. The man stood with his shotgun outside Grover's Mill. His name was William Dock. And the newspapers reported that he had taken up arms to go and fight the Martians in the woods. And they even claimed that he shot up a water tower in the woods, believing that it was a Martian tripod. But the trouble is, there's never actually been any solid evidence that he did anything that the newspapers claimed he did at the time. What is known about it is that reporters from New York Daily News arrived at the property the following day, and they were looking for what we'd call now a clickbait story, basically. And they convinced him to pose with his gun in front of the warehouse, opposite the old mill. They prompted him into telling this tall tale for the newspapers to run with. He didn't realise what he'd got himself into with this, and he became this quasi-folk hero. It became, like I say, like a poster boy for it, but it was more about the fact that he was a poster boy for gullibility than the fact that he was like a folk hero in the end. And he really ended up regretting getting involved with it, and he actually said that they made a joke of him. So it's another example of what the press do back then. So one of the things that I got into then was this idea of whether the whole idea of a panic was real, or how real was it. And that brought me back to this book again by A. Brad Schwartz, Broadcast Hysteria. In the last few decades, there's loads of information that's come to light which tells a different story about what happened with the War of the Worlds. And A. Brad Schwartz has written numerous articles, he's studied the subject, he's gathered evidence. I've looked actually at the evidence that he's gathered as well, because it's readily available in archives all over America. And he's gone back and looked at the original interviews, documents, testimonies, newspaper articles, and that kind of thing to inform his research. And he's studied these letters that are known to exist, written by people who felt compelled to comment on the broadcast at the time. So there were 600 letters to the FCC, the Federal Communications Commission. They're held in the National Archives in Maryland. I downloaded them from there, so I've been able to look at them as well. Almost 1,400 letters written to Orson Welles, the Mercury Theatre and CBS, and they're housed at the University of Michigan. I've also got them. Those documents allowed Schwartz to gain insight into how people really reacted to the things that were going on at the time. And I must make the point of saying here, this is not a complete vision of what actually happened, but it does give us a really good approximation of what kind of thing was going on at the time. And Schwartz used that information, he broke it all down into, he cross-referenced it all, he cross-referenced all the numbers, all how people reacted, all that kind, to get like an average gauge reaction. So a bit of dry information here for you, but it's important to point all this out so you get an overall idea of how people reacted to it. We had 619 letters written to the FCC. 321 of them were not frightened. 12 were not frightened but saw people who were. 2 were not frightened but saw panic. 10 momentarily believed the broadcast was real. 230 were frightened by the broadcast. 9 were told by someone else and became frightened. 8 were frightened and saw panic. 4 outright panicked. 3 panicked and saw panicking from other people. 19 did not hear the broadcast and were not frightened. And 1 did not hear the broadcast but saw panic. So a total of 619 letters, 350 were untouched by fright or panic, 269 showed evidence to some degree of fright or panic. So I'll move on now to the letters that were sent to CBS, Mercury Theatre and Orson Welles. 1,355 letters. 957 were not frightened. That's over 2/3 actually. 32 were not frightened but saw people who were. 6 were not frightened but saw panic. 47 momentarily believed that the broadcast was real. 170 were frightened by the broadcast. 14 were told by someone else and became frightened. 15 were frightened and saw panic. 17 panicked. 5 panicked and saw panic. 88 did not hear the broadcast and were not frightened. And 4 did not hear the broadcast but saw panic. So we have a total there out of that 1,355, 1,092 were untouched by fright or panic, and 263 showed evidence to some degree of fright or panic. So summing it up, 1,442 letters, 3/4 of them showed no signs of fright or panic, 532 do, so that's 1/4 that did. And now they talk about these numbers in millions in the newspaper articles that were written at the time, and that is obviously far from millions of people, but it does give us an average approximation. And it isn't just those letters, there is much more detail, much more documentation to look at that as well. So let's get into the idea now of how many people actually listen to it. So they say that from the surveys that were carried out after the broadcast, that roughly 6 million people listen to the broadcast. Even that figure is in question, but it's kind of an average. And then approximately 1 million had been, to varying degrees, it might be just briefly a little bit frightened, you know, but some obviously were panicked. 1 million of that data. And the CBS data showed that the Mercury Theatre on the air had a relatively small audience, at least relative to that region of America at the time, New York, Northeast, East Coast region. There's a lot of stories out there about 25 million people listening to it and all this kind of thing. 35 million people, it's just not true. The official data that's housed at CBS will tell you that. So there's this article called The Myth of the War of the Worlds Panic by Jefferson Pooley and Michael J. Socolo, 2013. And they write, the night the programme aired, the C.E. Cooper Rating Service telephoned 5,000 households for its national rating survey. To what programme are you listening, they said. The services asked respondents. Only 2% answered a radio play or Orson Welles programme or something similar, indicating CBS. None said a news broadcast. According to a summary published in Broadcasting, in other words, 98% of those surveyed were listening to something else or nothing at all on that night. So this idea of millions and millions and millions of people listening, it's just not the case. So another thing I need to stress here, I'm not saying that nobody panicked. There clearly were indications of some people panicking. But there was a genuine, palpable sense of fear and confusion that was going on in parts of the population, particularly in that East Coast region, New York and all that kind of thing. But it also appears that there were scattered fear-associated reactions further afield across America. Some of the newspapers saying mass panic across all of America. There were some cases of people who had telephoned other people and things like that, and maybe in the days afterwards had received letters from people, so they got a bit frightened. But that general nationwide panic idea, it actually is. Evidentially, it's a falsehood. So David L. Miller, in his book Introduction to Collective Behaviour and Collective Action wrote, there was a small spike in calls of minor unrest in New Jersey. However, there were no other calls to the police about panic or unrest across the US. The same is true of hospitals, who accounted for no additional injuries, heart attacks, suicide attempts or otherwise on that night in question. I've looked at that data as well. Now, I'm not saying there weren't heart attacks. Maybe there were people who committed suicide, but there's no evidence whatsoever that anything was related to the War of the Worlds broadcast. That's mainstream newspapers who were saying that, and press agencies. So Brad Schwartz, again in his book Broadcast Hysteria, he concluded these panicked scenes of flight and near flight which turned War of the Worlds into the stuff of American legend did happen, but they were very, very rare. He continues, it was only later, once the panic broadcast entered American folklore, that stories of jammed streets and groups of farmers roaming New Jersey countryside, shotguns ready to perforate the first spaceman they saw, began to spring up. This does not mean that there was no panic. A small but significant number of people were, terribly so. But saying that War of the Worlds panicked 1 million people would be as inaccurate as saying that it frightened none. 1 million Americans may indeed have briefly believed Earth was under attack from Martians that night, but almost none of them actually panicked. And if you get interested in this subject, I do encourage you to go away and look at the evidential data on this, because I'm only giving you like a snapshot of this here, but you really look into the data, it does back up this idea. So from that, we have now these guys that stepped in. Most of them were places like Princeton University, and that's social engineers, psychologists, that kind of thing. And they were fascinated with this idea of panic and fear amongst the population, because it's very alluring to these social psychologists. It's a good way that you can engineer the masses, social engineering through the media and all that kind of thing. We've always studied it way back in the midst of time. If you go back to Sun Tzu and the art of war and that, fear is the greatest enemy, it's psychological warfare, all that kind of thing. And that turned out to be precisely the case here with the War of the Worlds. Deep pockets, financial support, powerful entities. These people suddenly got involved with this. They loved it. They were all over it. So there are three entities that connect varyingly and directly and indirectly with the broadcast. And I am going to keep referring to them as the rest of this talk goes on. Some of you may recognise all three of them actually, but I'll point them out. So the first one is the Rockefeller Foundation. That's the biggie in all of this. The second one is Princeton University, then heavily funded by the Rockefeller Foundation. And the third one is the Tavistock Institute of Human Relations. I referred to them as I go on. So I have the front cover there of the annual report for the Rockefeller Foundation. You can go onto the Rockefeller Foundation's website. You can download them from about 1917 onwards to the present day. They are their official documentation. They obviously don't admit everything that they've spent their money on over the years, but they give you a general gist of the kind of things. They admit that they spent a lot of money studying this, the War of the Worlds. So September 1937, now this was actually 14 months before the broadcast of the War of the Worlds. They began funding this thing called the Radio Research Project, organised through Princeton University, funded by the Rockefeller Foundation. A number of researchers continue to incorrectly state that the Rockefeller Foundation funding of the Radio Research Project began after the War of the Worlds broadcast. That is not true, evidentially in their documentation, at least 14 to 16 months beforehand. So their own documentation proves otherwise. The Foundation granted $67,000 to Princeton University for a study of the value of radio to listeners to be carried out by university schools of public and international affairs during the 2-year period beginning 1937, September 1937. What role is radio playing in the lives of listeners? Answering this question evidently involves a number of secondary questions, such as who listens, where and when does listening take place, what is listened to, why and how do people listen, and what are the effects of listening. That's probably the most key point actually at the bottom there. What are the effects of listening? Because it's all about social psychology, that's what I was studying. The document continues. Relatively little is known of the listener as an individual with individual needs and interests that radio does or could serve, but those needs and interests are evidently fundamental in the use of radio for educational or cultural purposes. Methods developed in the industry's research point the way to the information that is needed. The first task of the Princeton Radio Research Project is to discover how those methods are to be modified or developed to serve its purposes. The study is being concluded by 3 men trained in the techniques of social research. Professor Paul Lazarsfeld serves as director, Professor Hadley Cantrell of Princeton University, and Dr. Frank Stanton of Market Research Division of Columbia Broadcasting System, CBS, as associate directors. Try and remember those names if you can. There will be a test. No, there won't actually. Paul Lazarsfeld, Hadley Cantrell, and Frank Stanton. So, Sunday the 15th of May 1938, a full 6 months before the War of the Worlds broadcast, the Cincinnati Enquirer reported that Radio Research Project was studying, with funding from the Rockefeller Foundation again, the popular NBC American soap opera One Man's Family. And the article said, some puzzling things have been done in the name of educational broadcasting, but to date the most puzzling is the test tube and slide rule analysis of One Man's Family. Using a grant from the Rockefeller Foundation, Princeton School of Public and International Affairs is to uncover the popularity secret of this top dramatic feature. So these are the key guys that were involved in the Radio Research Project. Paul Felix Lazarsfeld, he was the overall director of the RRP. Gordon Willard Allport, he was an assistant to Lazarsfeld. Theodore Adorno, chief of Radio Research Project's music division. Frank Nicholas Stanton, principal researcher, and Dr. Albert Hadley Cantrell, principal researcher as well. So let's start with Paul Lazarsfeld. So he was the head of the research project. He was an Austrian psychologist in Europe. He was a fellow traveller in the circles of the Tavistock Institutes. That's a big red flag straight away. Lazarsfeld arrived in America in 1933 on a 2-year Rockefeller Foundation fellowship. Once there, he worked in the field of applied psychology, accepting research contracts from government and private industry alike. He effectively invented market research. As a director of Columbia's Bureau of Applied Social Research, he became a renowned figure in propaganda and psychology in the media. And he and BASR's World War II era funding came from many sources, including the Office of War Information, which was the sister organisation to the OSS, which was the forerunner to the CIA, and he eventually what became the Voice of America, for those people who know that as well. That's the CIA outfit, effectively. We have Gordon Allport. I don't have a good picture of him to show you there. He's the key assistant of Paul Lazarsfeld. Excuse me. Allport was a pioneering psychologist, instrumental in establishing the values scale system, key component of PR, what was to come. He went on to be Tavistock Institute of Human Relations leading representative in the United States. He worked at Harvard Psychology Clinic, including an OSS and Tavistock Clinic funded psychological profiling study of Adolf Hitler at the time. It's interesting. Theodor Adorno, head of the music division. It was his first job in the US in 1937. He was a German sociologist, a philosopher, a music composer. He termed the phrase the culture industry. We hear that a lot nowadays. He was an associate of the Tavistock Institute of Human Relations. He was instrumental in changing, with the backing of the Rockefellers, the standard musical tuning pitch frequency from 432 Hz to 440 Hz. Anybody who's interested in that will know about positive frequencies in human body and negative frequencies. Tavistock Institute was involved with that. Experiments with music to create methods of control and social engineering. His name might be familiar to some people. I'm not going to get into it too much here because I completely sit on the fence on this subject. Dr. John Coleman claimed that he wrote the music and the lyrics for the Beatles. I'll leave that one for you to decide what you think of it. The Beatles. Yeah, Theodore Adorno. I suspect that he probably got involved in the social engineering side of pop music. I don't buy the idea that he wrote the lyrics and the music, but a lot of people do. But I'll leave that one for you to decide. I'm not getting to that one here today. Frank Stanton gained a master's degree in psychology in 1932 and a doctorate in 1935, both from Ohio State University. At CBS, he worked almost immediately as a psychological researcher. By 1937, he was the right-hand man of the head guy of CBS, that was William S. Paley. And the two built CBS from the ground up. He was also director of research at CBS with a staff of over 100 people. He was head psychological researcher, generic head of media research, and he was with the Radio Research Project and the investigator as well. And what's interesting here is that he was in a position to commission programming for CBS at the time of the War of the Worlds broadcast. So there are people who've claimed that Frank Stanton commissioned the War of the Worlds broadcast to be then studied by the Rockefeller Foundation. He was in a position to do that. I have not found any direct evidence of him doing it, but he was definitely one of a very small handful of people in CBS Radio that could have done that. He could have commissioned that at the time. He could also tailor the type of programming to the type of things that they were studying for the Radio Research Project as well. So backed by the Rockefeller Foundation, few outside that group would have known the real reasons why he was commissioning these programmings. If it was social engineering to do with the media, very few people who work in CBS would have known that was why that was being done. But I'm just speculating on that. So soon after the broadcast he became an executive, and then he was the head of CBS News Division. By 1942 he was vice president and president of CBS by 1946, and he remained in that role until 1971. So he's a very powerful person in American broadcasting. It was obviously going from radio into television at that point as well then. So I mentioned about this idea that Frank Stanton could have commissioned the War of the Worlds broadcast. A lot of it's circumstantial. Like I said before, we don't know that for certain. There's no way you can evidentially nail it down. But it's important to stress he was in a position to have done so, one of a few people who could have done so. But the mere possibility that he commissioned the War of the Worlds broadcast is hugely important as to the idea of the actual broadcast being specifically instigated. This is something you will read a lot when you start looking into what they call the conspiratorial side of the War of the Worlds, is that it wasn't just this random chance broadcast that people reacted to, that it was a psychological warfare experiment being carried out on radio to see how people would react to it. It wasn't just a fluke. All of his life, Stanton staunchly defended the idea that it was just a fluke. You know, there was nothing untoward about it. And he also said the mass panic story was real. Despite the evidence to the contrary, he maintained that all his life, millions of people across America panicked. It's convenient, I suppose, with the position he was in at the time. Other points of interest about Frank Stanton: he was a member of the Council on Foreign Relations. Some of you might know that name, which was co-created by the Rockefeller Foundation in 1918, further fully realised in 1921. He was a fellow of the American Association of Applied Psychology, a member of the American Psychology Association, the American Statistical Association, and the American Marketing Association. He was chairman of the Rand Corporation from 1961 to 1967. Detailed history of being involved with these agencies that are involved with global governance, military-industrial complex, that sort of thing, psychological warfare. And I mentioned about the RAND Corporation there. Lawrence and Nicholas Rockefeller, they both served on the advisory board for the RAND Corporation. Obviously, Frank Stanton as well. During World War II, Stanton served as consultant to Secretary of War, worked with the Office of War Information. Actually, most of the people in the Radio Research Project did that as well. He worked for the Office of Facts and Figures, worked for the Department of the Navy, and he served the latter four roles whilst the whole time working for CBS. That is a conflict of interest when we know these kinds of things go on, but he was involved with all of this psychological warfare, and he was spearheading all that was going on in broadcast media at the same time. That's convenient for propaganda, especially as you get into the World War II era then as well. This one's the doozy. He was a member of an uber elite and highly classified think tank called the Eisenhower 10, created by President Eisenhower in 1958 with the intention that its members would serve as a quasi-makeshift government in the event of a national emergency, not unlike the one that's portrayed in the War of the Worlds broadcast. E10 was seemingly discontinued, at least in that form, during the JFK presidency. People say this is rubbish. This is evidentially documented. This stuff is E10. This is a section from President Eisenhower's personal letter, his invitation to Frank Stanton, dated March 6, 1958, regarding the role he would play. I'm delighted to know of your willingness to serve as administrator of the Emergency Communications Agency in the event of a national emergency would compel its formation. Accordingly, I hereby appoint you such administrative effect upon activation of the agency. As administrator, you will, in the performance of your duties, be subject to the direction, control and coordination of the Director of Office of Emergency Resources. This is a key point here. In the event of an emergency, as soon as you've assured yourself by any means at your disposal that emergency communications agency has been activated, you shall immediately assume active direction of that agency and its function. This letter will constitute your authority. So it seems that he would effectively have been one of the 10 most powerful people in America in the state of an emergency, and it's interesting that he would have controlled the broadcast media communication system of America in the state of emergency. He's a very, very powerful man he was. I will come back to Stanton later. We're going to go on to this chap now. Hadley Cantrell is the final figure in the Radio Research Project. Ivy League educated and graduated Dartmouth College with a BS in psychology in 1928. At Dartmouth, Cantrell's roommate was Nelson Rockefeller, another connection there. They began a friendship that lasted for decades. Between 1929 and 1930, he studied psychology in Munich and Berlin, placing him in Tavistock-associated circles. In 1931, he received a PhD in psychology from Harvard. Between 1931 and 1932, he taught sociology at Dartmouth College. He also taught psychology at Harvard University between 32 and 35, and Columbia University between 35 and 36, so he was heavily into the field of social psychology. Prior to the Radio Research Project, he collaborated with his fellow Radio Research Project chap, Gordon Allport, on several psychological experiments relating to radio, working with the National Association of Broadcasters Canadian Radio Commission, Bureau of Educational Research, Edison Electrical Illuminating Company and Harvard Psychological Laboratory. And this resulted in a 1935 book called The Psychology of Radio. And in the book, they freely admitted that what they wanted to do was use the media to, quote, encourage people to think and feel alike. In 1936, he was approached by the Rockefeller Foundation to carry out some scientific polling for the 1936 US presidential elections. In the same year, he co-founded, alongside this chap called DeWitt Poole, a quarterly publication called Public Opinion Quarterly, which was also funded by the Rockefeller Foundation. It keeps cropping up all the time, this does. Later research showed that Public Opinion Quarterly was also co-funded by parties in the military-industrial complex. The chief edited by Harwood Childs. Cantrell was an associate editor. The board of editors included, these names again, Paul Lazarsfeld and Frank Stanton. So they're all moving in the same circles, doing the same kind of thing at the same time. In 1936, he joined Princeton Department of Psychology and remained there despite all the work he was involved with till 1969. Like Frank Stanton, he was also a member of the Council on Foreign Relations. In 1939, soon after the War of the Worlds broadcast, he established the Office of Public Opinion Research at Princeton with initial funding of $15,000 from the Rockefeller Foundation. Sound like I'm repeating myself here, don't I, with this Rockefeller Foundation theme. A further $20,000 from them in 1940, and it was there that he studied the effectiveness of psychopolitical operations regarding the media. He also did that work for the Office of Strategic Services, that's the OSS, which was the precursor to the CIA. His Princeton School of Public and International Affairs also received $25,000 from the Rockefellers in the same year, and that was to quote, for monitoring and assessing European shortwave radio transmissions. In World War II, he worked for the Rockefeller Foundation to establish Princeton Listening Centre, studying Nazi radio propaganda and how to apply such techniques to OSS propaganda, and that spawned the Foreign Broadcasting Intelligence Service, which eventually became US Information Agency. That was an arm of the National Security Council. So they're studying, these guys, they're all studying the War of the Worlds, and they're all studying the broadcast, they're all studying this idea of a mass panic. And it was because of that group and those people involved in that story of mass panic was cemented into popular culture. And the principal guy behind leading that narrative was that latter guy, Hadley Cantrell. According to Brad Schwartz in his book Broadcast Hysteria, he said, 3 days after the broadcast, Cantrell threw out whatever he had prepared for his course that term, Psychology 303, and lectured instead on War of the Worlds. He proposed that they initiate a study of the broadcast and audience reaction to it. Outlines were made, they did surveys, they did polls, they did interviews, and on November 21st, 1938, he returned to the Rockefeller Foundation and he asked them for even more money to study War of the Worlds. So his grant was outlining a proposed study of mass hysteria, emphasised how studying the broadcast was beneficial to propaganda. Specifically, he wanted to identify the psychological, educational and cultural factors that made individuals vulnerable to propaganda. 1 week after that proposal, he gets another $3,000 from the General Education Board to study the War of the Worlds. And that was additional to Rockefeller funding. CBS also got involved in it. They did loads of studies. They got Gallup polls involved in it. According to James F. Tracy in his piece, Early Psychological Warfare Research on the Rockefeller Foundation, Paul Lazarsfeld saw the event as especially noteworthy and immediately asked Frank Stanton for CBS funds to investigate reaction to what at the time was the largest immediate act of mass persuasion in human history. And what they ended up doing, they got all this information together, they studied the audience reaction, they studied the whole lot, and they fudged the data, completely fudged the data. We had this lady called Hazel Godet. She talked to about, I think it was probably a few thousand people in the end, but certainly there's several hundred anyway, and thoroughly documented. Frank Stanton initiated listening polls, surveys for the Radio Research Project. He did the same for CBS, independent of their study. Stanton allowed Hadley Cantrell to access the CBA survey, so they're cross-referencing all this information all the time. They're building up a massive picture of it. And A. Brad Schwartz in the book said, sorry, no, I'm missing that. Actually, that is the documentation I was talking about earlier, with all those data, all those letters, all those figures. That's largely that information that they gathered. So roughly a month and a half after the broadcast, Gallup conducted an extensive poll of reaction. That was also funded by the Rockefeller Foundation. Data was gathered for a year, over a year. It seemed to start to come to an end before that, because they were starting to come to some conclusions already. They were still gathering data, they hadn't finished gathering data, but they were already starting to shape what kind of story they wanted to tell about this broadcast. Despite the sizable amount of statistical data, they concluded they could only arrive at a general estimation of listener reaction. The estimates seemed to be sizably based on CBS and Gallup poll data. The information gathered, the results of the surveys and studies, they never fully materialised. They were paid all this money to do this thing, they were supposed to put out their final reports. Instead, a book came along, and I'll come to that in a minute. And the end of it is kind of, if you look into the official version of it, they say there was a fallout between Hadley Cantrell and Paul Lazarsfeld. There's some debate over who authored the final reports of the data and all that. But the final results was this book, The Invasion from Mars, and that had the final say on what happened. So it was published through Princeton University Press, and we had a version of the results of that study, published in 1940. The book is credited to Hadley Cantrell and Paul Lazarsfeld, with co-assisting credits given to Hazel Goodday and Herta Herzog. She's actually the wife of Paul Lazarsfeld. Cantrell took pretty much all the glory for that book. Lazarsfeld said that Cantrell had practically nothing to do with it, so there's a bit of a fudge one, that one is. But despite what the data's always told, that Cantrell was determined to show that there was this mass panic across America as a result of the broadcast. And in the book's findings, he skewed that bias. So bearing in mind the number of people that were listening and the reactions, we looked at that data already, that was just a cross-section of that data. The author, or authors of the book, whoever they say, it's Hadley Cantrell, but who knows, they cited only a couple of dozen personal accounts. Hundreds, but they just used a dozen. And those accounts were taken from 135 people, and they were specifically chosen from the New Jersey area where the reaction was most intense, and they specifically also chose people who were frightened and or panicked, usually panicked as well, and the most intense panicked reaction. So they were skewing the data to this idea, everyone's okay. So it's cited, there was a 10-page questionnaire, there was 100 of the 135 subjects were chosen because they believed the broadcast was real. Actually, if you look at the data, it's pretty much all like that. There's a handful that say they didn't believe in it, but yeah, the book concluded 6 million people heard the broadcast that night. It's that 6 million number again. At least 1 million of the listeners were frightened or disturbed. They called it a tidal wave of terror swept the nation on the night of the broadcast. And history judged Hadley Cantrell as being the final word on this. The book came out, it was published in 1940, and in academia it was the go-to text. People study it in media studies, even today they do. That book was published through funding from the Rockefeller Foundation as well. It found its way into Franklin Roosevelt's White House administration. Roosevelt loved it. He hired Hadley Cantrell. He was on the political payroll. That's a story for another time. The report was applauded. Like I say, it was studied in academia. It's a go-to text in media studies. And there were a few portrayals of it as well on TV. There was a radio... It was a play from 1957, The Night America Panicked. There was one from the 70s, called The Night America Trembled. I think I might have them the wrong way round. They, again, do the same thing. Everybody's running, packing up, going for the hills, all that kind of thing. The book was used by the military and the intelligence agencies, and political leaders liked it as well. There's even an infamous story that I cover in my book about Adolf Hitler liking it as well, but that's a subject for another time. Orson Welles cited the published finding as fact, and almost every interview he ever gave on the subject. I'm going to skip over this a little bit just to get to the end of it. So, yeah. So in conclusion, Hadley Cantrell, Welles... Oh yes, I should mention this actually. Orson Welles and Hadley Cantrell, they moved in very similar circles. A number of years before the War of the Worlds broadcast and afterwards. They had shared interest. One example, Nelson Rockefeller State Department Coordinator of Inter-American Affairs Office, a US intelligence arm focused mainly on psychological operations in Latin America during the 1940s. Cantrell and Welles both worked on that. They both gained funding directly and indirectly from the Rockefeller Foundation. So you get the actor, the main guy involved with the War of the Worlds project, is now being brought into it as well. He had this big break on the March of Time, which was Time Inc. They used the broadcast as a glorified advert for Time magazine. Financial connections, again, between Time Life magazine and the Rockefeller Foundation. It's all easily documented. Wells worked on some plays for the Federal Theatre project in the 1930s. Famous one was called Voodoo Macbeth, I think it was called. And the Federal Theatre project, much of their documentation, the Rockefeller Foundation, again, they funded it. Orson Welles met Howard Koch, who co-wrote the War of the Worlds broadcast with him on the Federal Theatre project. So he was being funded by the Rockefeller Foundation as well. So summing up these connections, we have people who worked on the War of the Worlds radio broadcast. They have connections to the Rockefeller Foundation. We've got a study of the War of the Worlds broadcast being funded by the Rockefeller Foundation. And all the people that were working involved with the study at the time, the radio research project, they were being funded by the Rockefeller Foundation. So the final report, Mass Panic, again published through funding for the Rockefeller Foundation. You seen the dots connecting here? No? So the final study, swathes of data was available, listener reaction, they disregarded it. They didn't care. They came to these conclusions, and for some bizarre reason, which I've got some theories on why that might be, no one's ever gone back and looked at this data. Brad Schwartz has recently. I've looked at it. I know a few other people have started to look at it now as well. But this story is there, this mass panic reaction to broadcast has been set in stone historically. It's become like an urban myth. It's told verbatim, retold, mainstream media and everything. The official narrative, loads of people listen to the War of the Worlds broadcasts. That's evidently not the case. Loads and loads are saying. Loads of people thought it was real. Evidently, I don't think that's really true. And loads of people panicked across America. Evidently, that can be disproven. So the question we have to ask ourselves is there, who steered it? I think it's obvious that at least the Rockefeller Foundation were involved in it, to their specific conclusions. And more importantly, the question is, why were they doing that? So I think we just managed to get there for the break. So I have some books with me tonight if anybody's interested. They're all £10 each. I've got an omnibus of science fiction, The Hidden Global Agenda, volumes 1 and 2 there. That's £20 because that's a double book. And there's a few DVDs there. They're £1 each as well if anybody's interested. But that's up to you. So thank you for listening. We'll have a break. See you in a minute. Right then, so what I'm going to do with the second half of the talk now is I'm really going to go down the rabbit hole. Anybody thought the first half was a bit deep? This is going to be a bit out there. And so I looked at these ideas of various people involved with it and the larger narrative behind the War of the Worlds broadcast. And there are these ideas that the broadcast itself was set up by financed powerful elites. So I mentioned the Rockefeller Foundation already, and that it was specifically designed as a psychological warfare experiment to see, firstly, to see if people would react a certain way, and then if they didn't, could they sell the story that people did react a certain way even though they hadn't. And I've got some ideas on that as well. These social psychologists, maybe they were just trying to get a really good job out of it afterwards, so they're telling these powerful people, look how maybe people react to it, and they actually hadn't, and they believed them, but that's, you know, that's a bit out there anyway. So this is an example, if you're searching for this kind of thing on the internet, this one's from, I think it was 1996, yes it was, documentary, called The Money Masters, International Bankers Gain Control of America. After what has been a closely guarded secret for nearly 50 years, Orson Welles' original broadcast turns out to be no mere show business stunt, but instead was a complex psychological warfare test conducted by C.D. Jackson, I'm going to come back to him in a minute, for the Rockefeller Foundation. When the results were compiled nearly 2 years later, they were released to an elite whose names most people will not speak over a whisper, among them groups like the Bilderbergers, the Trilateral Commission, Council on Foreign Relations and the Federal Reserve. Let's start with this idea that the broadcast was a psychological warfare experiment. Earlier in the talk I gave loads of examples of the Rockefeller Foundation connections, the aforementioned players that was involved with the radio research project, that kind of thing, and their study. But in order for the broadcast to have been initiated by the Foundation, they would have needed to have had some control over CBS broadcasting. And the Mercury Theatre on the air was a sustaining show, so it was an unsponsored programme. It did gain some sponsorship after the War of the Worlds broadcast by Campbell's Soup. And if you go to the DevEx Business Monitoring website, it evidently shows financial overlap between Campbell's Soup and the Rockefeller Foundation. So money was coming in to them, that theatre group, after the fact. But CBS was under Rockefeller influence before the broadcast. Circa 1933 onwards, the Rockefeller Foundation took over joint majority control alongside Floyd Odlum's Atlas Corporation of RKO Pictures. Rockefeller involvement with RKO was all-encompassing, lasted until the early 1940s. Post-War of the Worlds, Orson Welles had a great deal of success. Orson Welles' Citizen Kane, a film that gained green lit by Nelson Rockefeller. RKO was founded in October 1928 by RCA and its chair David Sarnoff. Sarnoff was also co-founder of CBS alongside William Paley, same William Paley that I mentioned before. And I've lost where I am now. So he employed Frank Stanton at CBS and eventually gave him CBS presidency. Documented in Richard James DeSoco's book, Clash of Dynasties, CBS was bossed by Rockefellers as part of their media monopoly with NBC. CBS was interlocked through the Rockefeller Foundation. Frank Stanton, president of CBS for 25 years, from the post-war era to 1971, was a trustee of the Rockefeller Foundation. 1917, Democratic Congressman Oscar Callaway spoke about an elite cabal Families such as the Morgans, the Rothschilds, the Rockefellers, conspiring to take control of the media. And I'm going to skip over this little bit here, because basically what they did was they monopolised the print media. So they took over like 50, 100 newspapers, they whittled it down to about 10, they moved people into the positions of power in these newspapers to favour specific political narratives. That narrative was exposed by this chap called Norman Dodd during the 1950s, Director of Research for Reece Committee, a group charged by the US House of Representatives with investigating the activities of foundations like Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, the Ford Foundation and the Rockefeller Foundation. He exposed, this was television media then, that these groups like the Rockefeller Foundation were basically controlling the media at that point in time. Orson Welles admitted that the War of the Worlds broadcast was an experiment intended to psychologically manipulate the mass listening audience. This is what he had to say on the matter.
I still meet people all over the place, everywhere in the world, who've had experiences, bitter or otherwise, as a result of our little experiment in broadcasting. I suppose we had it coming to us because, in fact, we weren't as innocent as we meant to be. When we did the Martian broadcast, we were fed up with the way in which everything that came over this new magic box, the radio, was being swallowed. People, do suspect what they read in the newspapers and what people tell them, but when the radio came, I suppose now television, anything that came through that new machine was believed. So the way our broadcast is an assault on the credibility of that machine, we wanted people to understand that they shouldn't take any opinion predigested, and they shouldn't swallow everything that came through the tap, whether it was radio or not.
Okay, so he said those involved, including himself, weren't as innocent as we were meant to be. Specifically calls the broadcast our little experiment in broadcasting. Implies that there was a specific intent behind it to experiment on the audience, and he also pushed the panic narrative. If you watch the larger, because I've cribbed that down a little bit, but if you watch the larger interview there, he tells these stories, anecdotal, about people panicking all over America and that kind of thing, so he's pushing that. So, but he appears to give himself a bit of a get out here, because he said that this little experiment they were carrying out had some kind of honourable intentions to it, that they were trying to wake people up to the naivety of broadcast media and that kind of thing, people believing in it wholly without questioning it. But he did say, had no idea of the extent of the thing, so he's trying to give himself a bit of wiggle room there, but he called it our little experiment in broadcasting, messing with people's minds, that sort of thing. So Wells, how did he find out about the extent of the thing? So I'm going to skip over a little bit of this, but basically what happened was there's this documentary called Orson Welles' The Untold Story Behind the War of the Worlds, and they interviewed people from the Mercury Theatre company and Orson Welles about how they found out about it. So they left CBS after the broadcast. I think at one point in it the police had already started to turn up. I don't know how that happened. That's sort of kind of anecdotal. But they were leaving the theatre, they were walking through New York, and they passed this thing called the Zipper. And the Zipper was basically saying that there was a mass panic all over America. Bearing in mind, this was like only an hour. So how were they already telling this story that soon after it? The Zipper was owned, in Times Square, it was owned by the New York Times newspaper. And according to Wikipedia, it's not the best source on these things, but I have evidentially verified this. Arthur Hayes Sulzberger was publisher of the New York Times from 1935 to 1961. He also served as trustee of the Rockefeller Foundation from 1938 to 1957. Sulzberger also credited with the quote, "We journalists tell the public which way the cat is jumping, the public will take care of the cat." And he was also a member of the Council on Foreign Relations. So he was in charge of the Zipper. So there's that steering the narrative. Go even further down the rabbit hole now. These grand claims that are made about the War of the Worlds broadcast. One of them, you might know this guy, William Cooper, a very famous alternative knowledge researcher. In the 1990s he wrote this document called Majesty 12. And he said, the plan to create an artificial extraterrestrial threat to the Earth was tested for credibility with the CBS presentation of War of the Worlds by Orson Welles in the Mercury Theatre. The public believed it was real. We'll dispute that, but he was saying this back in the 1990s and the evidence wasn't quite so available as it is now, so we'll let him off the hook on that one. The public believed it was real, thus setting the stage for implementation of an alien threat scenario. The only problem was that the state of the art of the technology at the time did not allow for a believable presentation. Okay. So where did that claim come from? It started, again, with Orson Welles. This was 1973. Orson Welles puts out this docudrama called F for Fake. He co-wrote it, he directed it, he starred in it, and it talked about the nature of authorship, authenticity, fakery, that kind of thing. And large sections of this documentary were complete fabrications, they were complete lies, but they were portrayed as real. And they've got little tiny slithers of truth in there, and he does say there's actually a very small percentage of this is true, but I'm not going to tell you which parts are true. You're going to have to figure that out for yourself in the documentary, that's what he said. So he's blending half-truths with almost seemingly into total fabrications. And he was concerned largely with forgery in the art world, but the film takes this bizarre turn all of a sudden at this point. This is from a trailer that was made in 1976 for F for Fake, and I've cut a little bit out of it. It's just, it beggars belief. What was he playing at?
Ladies and gentlemen, suppose I come right out with it and admit to you now that my old Martian hoax on the radio was, well, not exactly a hoax. That there were secret sponsors of that broadcast who were in fact some rather influential beings from outer space. You smile.
Yeah, I am.
I think they're smiling, Gary. I'd just like to remind them that it is since that broadcast that there have been in this country alone authenticated sightings. You still think it's a joke? Good. That's the way we want you to feel about it. For now.
So people have blown up the significance of this little clip from F for Fake.
Scary.
Yeah. What they're trying to say is, well, first of all, let's point out, he says that they had secret sponsors. Now, let's leave the idea of aliens aside for a minute. I mean, we've already established that there's some secret sponsors involved with this, and that's probably the Rockefeller Foundation, amongst other things. But he says he doesn't want people to believe what he's saying. He's mocking the matter. He's playing into this larger idea of grander designs. And many places on the internet where people have taken these words verbatim. They've taken it literally. Orson Welles was saying this was all about ETs and UFOs, and that aliens might have been behind the broadcast. I mean, I laugh, but you know, I'll get further into that in a moment. I'll leave that one for you to decide, but I find that idea of secret sponsors interesting. Now, go back to Hadley Cantrell. There were many people involved with what I call the muddling of the ET UFO subject that were very interested in the research that was done by the Radio Research Project and Hadley Cantrell. The first one is the Durant Report, 1953, the Robertson panel convened by the CIA to look into problems of widespread reports of UFO sightings and their place within the context of national security. They were debunking the subject and muddling it, disinformation, all that kind of thing. That's what the CIA were up to with this. And they produced this thing called the Durant Report. It concluded the national security agencies take immediate steps to strip UFOs of the special status they have been given and the aura of mystery they have been unfortunately acquired. And it also recommended instituting a policy of education to reassure the public of the lack of evidence. And Hadley Cantrell's invasion from Mars is specifically cited in the document, and Cantrell's work, Cantrell's noted as somebody who's specifically working in the field of perception management and could greatly benefit that proposal of education. It's documented there in the document. The debunking aim would result in reduction in public interest in flying saucers, which today evokes a strong psychological reaction. This education could be accomplished by mass media. I was talking to a few people earlier about this idea of science fiction, how it affects perception management on all these kinds of subjects. Flying saucers, which today evokes a strong psychological reaction. The education could be accomplished by media such as television, motion pictures and popular articles. Members of the panel have various suggestions related to the planning of such an educational programme. It was felt strongly that psychologists familiar with mass psychology should advise on the nature and extent of the programme. In this connection, Dr. Hadley Cantrell, Princeton University, was suggested. Cantrell authored Invasion from Mars, you know about that study, since performed advanced laboratory studies in the field of perception. The education programme of training and debunking outlined above might be required for a minimum of 1.5 to 2 years. At the end of this time, the dangers related to flying saucers should have been greatly reduced, if not eliminated. Cooperation from other military services and agencies concerned would be necessary. So they were talking about Hadley Cantrell's work was a key indicator of this, how they could use that. Another document, Brookings Institute, another infamous one in the field of perception management of that subject, published, dated April 18th, 1961, known as Proposed Studies of the Implications of Peaceful Space Activities, that's a mouthful, for Human Affairs. It's a subcommittee on submitted to Committee of Science and Astronautics of the United States House of Representatives. Hadley Cantrell is mentioned again. It's two separate things going on at different time periods, everything. Such studies would include historical reactions to hoaxes, psychic manifestations, unidentified flying objects, etc. Hadley Cantrell's study, Invasion from Mars, would provide a useful, if limited, guide in this area. They suggested circumstances when leaders around the world, political leaders, might find it advisable to withhold information from the public, and they talk about Cantrell's study as being useful in that area. I've got to mention this as well, the involvement of the Rockefeller Foundation, specifically people like Lawrence Rockefeller, involved in things like the New Age movement and the ET subject. He gave $250,000 a year to the Centre for Psychology and Social Change, co-founded by alien abduction researcher John Mack. He established the UFO Disclosure Initiative to the Clinton White House and gave financial support to Dr. Stephen Greer's ET UFO Disclosure Project. So Rockefeller money behind that. I will say where the Disclosure Project, I think there are some legit people on that that were talking about genuine things. But I think there was a steering going on there with that. And a lot of people were obviously disinformation agents as well. My perspective on that, it's a limited hangout in terms of Rockefeller influence over it. Not everybody that was involved in disclosure, but I think Rockefeller were trying to steer and corner for whatever reasons they had. So yeah, let's just move that. So if you think about that steering of it, really, if the War of the Worlds broadcast was doing the same kind of thing, it would make sense why the Rockefeller money was behind it. So I mentioned before this chap called C.D. Jackson. And like I say, if you go and do searches on this on the internet, you'll find his name connected to it. William Cooper mentioned him, and you come across this name, Charles Douglas C.D. Jackson, and he was the main guy, what some people claim, behind the War of the Worlds Psyop idea. So a recap. The broadcast was a complex psychological warfare test conducted by C.D. Jackson for the Rockefeller Foundation. So who is C.D. Jackson? I'm just going to read out a few things. There's a lot more to this, but these are just some key things I've found. He's involved with Office of War Information, Office OSS, precursor to the CIA, British Warfare Executive. He was Deputy Chief of Psychological Warfare Division, Supreme Allied Headquarters Expeditionary Forces at the end of World War II. He served with the OSS. He served with the CIA from 1948. He worked for the Eisenhower administration, and a position that was effectively the head of the National Security Council. He was a speechwriter for Eisenhower in 1952, special assistant to the President for International Affairs, US delegate to the United Nations. He was in charge of, alongside Nelson Rockefeller, policy oversight of combined CIA, USIA, US Information Agency and US military country plans during the Hook insurrection in the Philippines in the 50s. He also worked in the media. He graduated from Princeton University in 1924, found himself working in press and broadcast media as Vice President of Time Inc. from 1931 to 1964, and those early years would have placed him in the immediate vicinity of Orson Welles, CBS, the Mercury Theatre, that kind of thing. He was also a publisher for Fortune magazine, which was Rockefeller connected. 1948, he was also involved in Operation Mockingbird. That was the CIA injecting agents into broadcast media, print, that kind of thing, movies as well. And he was all over the ET UFO subject, specifically Betty and Barney Hill. I'll come to that in a minute. So he was a member of NICAP, the National Investigations Committee on Aerial Phenomenon, and they investigated North America's first widely publicised alien abduction, I shall say that in quote marks, account of Betty and Barney Hill. Those unfamiliar, I'll just give you a very brief idea of what they say that happened to them. The Hills claim to have been abducted by extraterrestrials whilst driving through a rural part of New Hampshire in the late evening of September 19th, 1961. Their claim goes that they witnessed a large structured craft above and in front of their car and stopped to investigate. They encountered the inhabitants of the craft, panicked and sped off in their car, pursued all the time by the craft. A buzzing and static surrounded the car, rendering them unconscious. The next thing they knew, they were driving their vehicle 35 miles away from their previous location. So Betty Hill telephoned Pease Air Force Base and talked about the experience they'd had. She didn't have much luck with that, but a few days later she got hold of this book by this chap called Donald E. Kehoe. It's a UFO book, and he was the head of NICAP at the time. And Kehoe dispatched NICAP investigator Walter N. Webb, and he did a 6-hour interview with the Hills on October 21st. Throughout November, Betty alleged that she was experiencing vivid dreams about what eventually became called missing time during their encounter. And that prompted NICAP to send somebody else out, November 25th, 1961, two chaps, Robert E. Homan and, yes, you've guessed it, C.D. Jackson. In the interview, he was the one who brought up this idea that they'd travelled, missing time, and he suggested that they'd be hypnotised. So according to Philip Coppins in his book The Pied Pipers of the CIA, it was Jackson who drew the Hills' attention to their missing time period. Until he did so, the couple had not realised their memories of that fateful night were incomplete. It was Jackson who suggested hypnotic regression as a means of unlocking it. It was Jackson who arranged for one of the Army's top psychiatric experts to undertake the regression as if a civilian expert was not available, under which the full story of the joint abduction emerged. However, as many researchers have since demonstrated, a careful review of the timings actually shows there was no missing time at all. It seems that Betty and Barney Hill were at the centre of a web that involved US Air Force intelligence, top military experts in psychological warfare. The evidence suggests that the Hills were subjects, victims of a psychological experiment. So potentially you're talking about MyLabs and things like that there, potentially. He said that there was all the hallmarks of psychological warfare, social engineering experiments, military-industrial complex would have been behind that. I'll leave that one for you to decide. I think that something happened to Betty and Barney Hill. I would never say what I think it exactly was. I think they experienced something. I'm open to the idea that it might be something out there, who knows, but I do very much sit on the fence on that one. But it was Jackson's work that steered that narrative. And that's where you need to look at Jackson's career again, because he played a part in muddling that narrative up completely. He steered their narrative, and NICAP helped to turn their story into this world-renowned story. It kicked off that whole idea of alien abduction phenomenon into the public consciousness. So Jackson, as I said before, he was involved in psychological warfare research and experiments. I'm being buzzed by a helicopter. Particularly for intelligence outfits like the OSS. It's interesting when I'm talking about this. Yeah. Particularly for intelligence outfits like the OSS and the CIA. NICAP had a sizable membership amongst the intelligence community. One example was CIA briefing officer Carl Flock. He was a chairman of NICAP's Washington DC subcommittee during the late 1960s and early 1970s. Another example was Colonel US Air Force retired Joseph Bryan III, founder and first chief of the CIA psychological warfare staff. That's documented on the NICAP website. NICAP affiliations are downplayed, the affiliation, with the intelligence community. People say, amongst certain aspects of the researchers into the ET UFO phenomenon, that these people have got a genuine interest. I find that very naive, because there's libraries worth of information showing how intelligence community and the military muddled and steered that whole subject. Many CIA affiliated members probably did have an interest in the subject, but years of research into these kinds of subjects has shown, and I think it's a general rule of thumb, that anybody who works for the intelligence community, first and foremost, they work for the intelligence community. They've got their NDAs, they've got their national security and all the rest of it, so maybe they are interested in the subject, but their first priority, these people live and die by it, patriotism, duty, country, it always comes first. I'm not saying that they're not interested in the subject, but where are the priorities there? All the aforementioned, you can understand why C.D. Jackson's name is regularly cited in terms of the War of the Worlds broadcast as an experiment in perception management, particularly where it connects to the ET UFO subject. Unfortunately, all of this, the connections with C.D. Jackson, it comes to a dead end. He moved in all the same circles, he was involved in all the same kind of research, he was doing the same kind of jobs, but I've never been able to evidentially, solidly nail down that C.D. Jackson was involved with the War of the Worlds broadcast, or that he steered it, or he, I don't know. But almost impossible, because there is one little thing which I find interesting. Hello? April 4th, 1951. Psychological Strategy Board, PSB, was formed. The PSB ran for 2 short years, coming to an official end in 1953. During that time, their entire mandate was psychological warfare. The members of this group included Paul Lazarsfield, Radio Research Project; Hadley Cantrell, Radio Research Project; Franz Stanton, Radio Research Project; Harold Laswell, associated with all of them, associated with CBS; William Paley, CBS; George Gallup, conducted all the polls for CBS on the Radio Research Project; Elmer Roper, connected to the Rockefellers, connected to Frank Stanton; DeWitt Poole, I mentioned it before, he's involved with that quarterly magazine that Hadley Cantrell, Frank Stanton were all involved in. You're seeing the connections here. And the other person involved was C.D. Jackson, who I can't evidently find any connections to the War of the Worlds. So it's bizarre. It's the last person that has no direct or indirect involvement with the Radio Research Project and the broadcast. All the others do. What's that about? What is that about? So the Psychological Strategy Board, does it fit the time frame? No, it doesn't really, because it was 1950s. The broadcast was in 1938. So this is circumstantial, is it? It leaves that question: was he involved in a Psyop with the War of the Worlds broadcast? I don't know. It hasn't stopped many alternative researchers from claiming that he has, though. You go on the internet, you'll find articles that verbatim say C.D. Jackson was involved with it. I don't know. Maybe it's just that he was very good at covering his tracks. I mean, the positions of power he had, the jobs he was doing, maybe he's just got away with it for history. We'll never be able to prove it now. But my gut instinct tells me that he's been tacked on to this notion of the War of the Worlds being a psyop, because it allows them to channel the War of the Worlds broadcast into the ET UFO arena, which directs it away from more conventional psychological warfare in the media. That's my take on it anyway. So if you look at the Radio Research Project study, played into military and intelligence psychological warfare, I mentioned the Brookings Institute report, the Durant report, and that template for 1938 War of the Worlds broadcast probably inspired and even influenced some of the work. I'm no doubt that it did for decades. You look at the involvement of these groups involved in the UFO ET subject, the military, the CIA, that kind of thing. And we're seeing that today. Those people, you see these congressional hearings that have been going on this year. These why they're not called UFOs anymore, they're called UAPs now. And I'm seeing all the hallmarks of that with these congressional hearings, these whistleblowers and all that kind of thing. There's lots of takes out there, and what I'm saying might be controversial to some people. Some ufologists, they're convinced that we are approaching this point of disclosure, that the disclosure of the whole subject has arrived, basically. But I'm very dubious. The reason is that powerful agencies and organisations, they've muddled and steered that subject. It's a perception management operation for almost a century. And they've mocked it and they've ridiculed it. Whenever you hear stories about ETs and UFOs and that kind of thing in the mainstream media, they're basically just taking the proverbial out of it. They don't want you to take it seriously. Whether that's part of the psyop, I don't know. Why all of a sudden now are they trying to give it serious mainstream attention? Well, what's changed? And that, to me, I think is part of the bigger covert agenda. Government, big business, military industrial complex, they're not known for being honest or truthful or caring about people. So I think what we're seeing there is a stage managed psyop. That's my own personal take on that. Some people have suggested that seeming disclosure is the primer for a staged, the helicopters will probably come back now, staged ET UFO event. Back in the 1990s, alternative knowledge researcher Serge Monas. Check out Mark Conlon's research on this subject, because he really goes into this idea of the technology, the real technology that is available that could potentially do these things. But check that out, please do. He suggested that a plan for a one-world globalist government would instigate it using advanced technologies to stage various large-scale events across the world, the scope of which would be so incredible that the masses would readily accept them as real and comply with any and all government edicts that would follow. He called it Project Bluebeam. No, no, take it seriously. I'll leave that for you to decide what you think about that subject. It's a fascinating subject. It's a proper rabbit hole to go down, Project Bluebeam is. One part of the research echoes the War of the Worlds broadcast. He said, psychological preparations for the first step have already been implemented with the film 2001 A Space Odyssey. I'll cover that in Science Fiction and the Global Agenda. The Star Trek series, I'll cover that as well, very in depth. Independence Day, all of which deal with invasions from space and the coming together of all nations to repel the invaders. The fourth step concerns the universal supernatural manifestation with electronic means. Contains 3 different orientations. One is to make mankind believe that an alien off-world invasion is about to occur at every major city on the Earth. I just want to mention Carol Rosin here. And she was one of the whistleblowers' testimonies at the Disclosure Project in 2000. She was a former NASA employee, worked closely for many years with former NASA stalwart Wernher von Braun. And he allegedly told her that a secretive transnational power would eventually make a move to permanently take control of the planet via a hoaxed alien invasion from outer space. Whatever you make of that, I think maybe there's a bit of steering going on there, being led false information, who knows. But I think she was being genuine. I think she was being honest. Whether what she was saying was real or not is a different matter. I think she genuinely believed what she'd been exposed to. She said what was most interesting to me was a repetitive sentence that he said to me over and over again during the approximately 4 years that I had the opportunity to work with him. He said the strategy was being used to educate the public and decision makers was to use scare tactics. That was how we identify an enemy. The last card was being held by extraterrestrial enemy card. He mentioned that extraterrestrials were going to be identified as the final enemy against whom we were going to build space-based weapons back in 1974. Wernher von Braun actually told me that the spin was a lie, that the premise for space-based weaponry, the reasons we were going to be given, the enemies we were going to identify were all based on a lie. It's based on a few people making a lot of money and gaining power. It's about ego. It's about a few people who are really playing an old, dangerous, costly game for their own pocketbooks and power struggles. That is all it is. Now, away from the ET UFO paradigm, because I'm going to depart a little bit from that, there's more tangible, more sort of surface level ways you can see this idea of a potential template for what happened with the War of Those broadcasts and the study by the Radio Research Project afterwards. In my book, I get into things like 9/11, I mention some stuff from World War II, I think I touched a little bit on climate change, things like this, elements to do with the Cold War. You can see the model of that throughout the decades on these big events. But one subject that I didn't cover in my book, because I published the book just before it happened, was the events of 2020 onwards. I'm not going to dwell on this too much, but I just want you to think about the parallels here. Most of you may be aware of this, but I just want to point them out again. The World broadcast and subsequent study convinced the world that people had reacted a certain way, despite considerable evidence otherwise. That everybody was terrified, that everybody was huddled in their homes, again, despite evidence to the contrary, that the numbers were in the millions, again, despite the contrary. People gleaned much of their information from what was going on, from the media, when in fact, most people, and I experienced this myself, with a little bit of common sense, you go outside, you see what the real world was like outside. It's Jack and Ori on the news compared to what the real world was like. Does any of that sound familiar? Like the War of the Worlds? The success of the 2020 narrative was largely driven by 2 factors. One is grossly over-exaggerated statistical data, like the War of the Worlds. The second one is media-driven fear-mongering, like the War of the Worlds. So the evidence I've gathered about the Radio Research Project study shows that data, public reaction, all that kind of thing, was misrepresented, misinterpreted, biased, exaggerated, sometimes wholly ignored. Just to mention one brief piece of information here, you may be aware of this, but this was true in 2020. Key example here was the data released by NHS England in 2021. By March of that year, just 689 people under the age of 60, I should make this clear here, under the age of 60 and with no comorbidities, only 689 people had died seemingly from COVID in England and Wales, and that data is available to check out. So based on 2021's UK population, 67 million at the time, that equates to 0.001% of the UK's population over a year. So you don't hear that on the nightly news put out like that. Spinning of data, it was obvious, again it ties back to the War of the Worlds thing. Non-CV deaths were sizably certified as CV deaths. Deaths became infected, infected became cases, cases became test positives, so it goes. So away from that, I just want to look now at these fear-based parallels between the War of the Worlds and 2020. I showed some of these in little slides earlier on. These are newspaper articles. The key word there being terror. Emotive and fear-based wording in our newspaper articles. We have hysteria, panic, terrifies. Where is that one? Yeah, terrifies. And we have the whole war thing as well, which is something that was used a lot in 2020, this wartime spirit rubbish and all that. Scares the nation, stirs terror. What's that one? Yeah. Spreads panic, spread. Interesting word. A few headlines here. I'm not going to dwell on this too much, but this is kind of where you're going with this whole fear narrative. Some headlines, the legit headlines, you can check them out. Places like The Sun, The Guardian, the BBC, The Express. That CV leaves Wuhan a zombie land with people collapsing in the streets. US passes 10 million COVID cases as virus rages across the nation. UK on war footing as elderly face isolation. Coronavirus horror. London mortuaries expand to prepare for massive surge in deaths. NHS heroes death on the front line. Grim milestone as virus cases top 25 million globally. London faces Christmas lockdown today as new super infectious COVID mutant Martian, I should say, spreads. You thought these were extreme. There's put a bit of humour into it, and some people might not find this funny, but COVID-19 found in semen of infected men. People over 6 foot have a double risk of CV. People who contract COVID may develop red and swollen toes which turn purple. Every symptom you need to be aware of, including COVID toes and hiccups. Is testicle pain potentially a sign of COVID? COVID-19 could cause erectile dysfunction. Health officials recommend glory holes for safe sex during pandemic. Why your pets should be socially distanced. And the last one, ice cream tests positive for coronavirus in China. I mean, what could you say? This is a good book. I don't agree with everything she says, but it's a really good book worth checking out. Laura Dodsworth's State of Fear. And it's based on a wealth of evidential data. She's also got whistleblowers, insiders that she spoke to and got information from them. And the book highlights the UK's behavioural insights team, nudge units, like print, broadcast, social media, shaping and affecting mass thinking and behaviour during 2020. Check out things like 77th Brigade as well, Spy B, Mindscape document, all that kind of thing. Social engineering through the media. It's rampant, absolutely rampant nowadays, particularly so when this was going on. So they used fear-mongering, extreme levels of fear-mongering to get compliance, control, sizable number of the world's population. And it's clear that the media had, if you'd taken the media out of what was going on in 2020, things would have been very, very different. Very different. And Orson Welles seemed to have foreshadowed that, again, back in 1938. Because when he was setting up the War of the Worlds broadcast, he hadn't just nailed it down that he was going to do War of the Worlds. He actually had 3 stories that he wanted to choose from. One was War of the Worlds, another was Arthur Conan Doyle's The Lost World, and the other was MP Shield's The Purple Cloud. And that story concerns this amorphous, virus-like, almost unseen natural force that's sweeping across the face of the earth, killing everybody in its path. Wells rejected that story because he didn't believe that people would be hoodwinked by it. It wasn't realistic enough, and it wasn't immediate enough. And it shows how much more innocent the world was back in 1938, and sadly, how much more easily people have been fooled today, particularly in 2020 onwards. Going forwards, it appears that we've actually, in many ways, gone backwards. Simpler times. And I just want to dwell on that idea for a moment, this idea of simpler times, simpler living, that, because this is where I'm kind of bringing the talk to an end now. Because it's clear to me that the War of the Worlds broadcast and the subsequent study created like a template. It's almost like a tracing paper you could put over the top of so many things in history. It's fear-based media propaganda, conditioning. It's continued ever since. It clearly inspired psychological warfare experts, social scientists, to shape the role of the media into what it is today. And studying the media, we can easily recognise how unhealthy and sinister it is. Neil Postman, Amusing Ourselves to Death. This is a book that was written in the 1980s, a fantastic book. He was a media academic. He said, to be unaware that a technology comes equipped with a programme for social change, to maintain that a technology is neutral, to make the assumption that a technology is always a friend to culture, At this late hour, stupidity, plain and simple. Let's talk about television, back in the 1980s. So, how can we remove ourselves from this paradigm? It's easy, really. Most of you may know this. I might be preaching to the choir, but we'll say it anyway. The first thing, stop watching the news. There are far better ways to be informed about the world around you. Beyond that, just stop paying attention to the mainstream media. I would say that it easily applies to online media, especially social media. Reading that out of your life, it's a detoxification of your body, mind and soul. It really is. If you're in the presence of the media, you do have to be exposed to it. Always pay close attention to things that they aren't saying rather than what they are. Look for the subtext, watch the body language, the inflections. Be sceptical. Question things all the time. Even if it seemed outrageous, question everything. Research the subjects that they're talking about and discuss them for yourself. Ask yourself, what is it that they want me to think and why? And allow yourself to think freely and critically. Form your own ideas, thoughts and conclusions rather than allowing other people to do it for you. You'll be happier, fear-free, more content, healthier in your body and mind, and probably the best thing you ever do in your life. And with that, I just want to say thank you so much for coming tonight and listening to me. If you want to check out my YouTube channel, Electric Media Madness, I'm starting to move into this area now. It was reviews of stuff to begin with, but I'm getting into alternative knowledge research. So if you can hit subscribe for me, that would be brilliant. I really appreciate it. And thank you very much.